I would like to start the podcast this week talking about the Mr. McMahon documentary over there on Netflix, the Vince McMahon doc that had everyone talking, of course, for multiple reasons. I watched all 6 episodes, was able to cram those in, even talked about it on stream last Friday, and I'm going to summarize all my thoughts here, bring it all together to give you my impressions, and ultimately, I guess, a review of what I thought about it. I guess the broad strokes is that I feel like it was a documentary that was caught in an identity crisis. Didn't exactly know which way to swing, and one where if you're already a wrestling fan, and you know, and I mean a long time wrestling fan, I don't know how much new information was gleaned here. I don't know if there was stuff that you didn't know. I think it, did a good job in preaching to as wide an audience as possible. It cast a very wide net, but maybe for more hardcore fans like myself, maybe this one was a little bit of a tedious watch. Maybe this one had you groan in certain circumstances. But I think overall, the problem was this question of an identity crisis. That being said, I understand why there was an identity crisis, why maybe it felt like I was watching a doc that was trying to position itself, because let's not forget, this is important to point out, in 2019 is when the production on this doc series started, right, with Chris Smith. It was originally planned to be like, I believe at first it was supposed to be a movie, right? And then it turned into a 4-part series and was ready to release around WrestleMania time in 2022. But then the Wall Street Journal dropped the bombshells about reporting that, the first bombshell, reporting that the WWE Board of Directors was investigating Vince McMahon for allegedly paying off a woman to silence claims of an affair. And this set off a cascade of revelations and investigations. We're not going to reiterate that. It ultimately led to, I guess, the biggest bombshell being the Janelle Grant lawsuit, but we're not going to go down that path specifically. Most of you probably already know all about it. If you're new to this, well, you can easily check it out. You can easily search for it. I even recommend following WrestleNomics and Post Wrestling. Both Brandon Thurston and John Pollock, respectively, have been doing tremendous work in staying on top of the story. So the information is out there. But once that happened, coming back to the doc itself, once these allegations started appearing, these reports started bubbling up, WWE Studios, who was once involved in the production of the documentary, quietly distanced itself, removing its name from the production. And you could already see that this was a bit of a concern for them, since it was a pretty bold move to do. Vince, even after that, decided he tried to buy the documentary back from Netflix. I guess he was afraid of how he was going to be portrayed in here, and that added a little extra layer of chin scratching. We're like, what is exactly going on? What is being talked about in this doc, right? He reportedly felt the documentary portrayed him in a negative light, which is ironic considering Vince usually doesn't care much about that, and he has a tendency, to blur the lines between himself and his Mr. McMahon character, and I think that's a significant it's a significant part of the doc. And one of the things that Vince has ended up really criticizing is that you never see the real me here. But what is the real Vince McMahon? Who is the real Vince McMahon? Even people interviewed in the documentary admitted that they weren't sure where the character ended and the real Vince began. A lot of people were even saying The character is just an extension of Vince, maybe a little more exaggerated, but nonetheless, they could see Vince in Mr. McMahon itself. So if his concern was that he was being portrayed in a negative light because the documentary makers weren't able to separate Vincent Kennedy McMahon from Mr. McMahon, isn't that kind of what he wanted? Why would he be so upset with the way he was shown, especially since at the start of the doc, Vince basically outright says, that he's not going to tell everything, right? He sits down and he says something to the effect of, well, all the stories I could tell you. And the interviewer, he goes, yeah, that's what we're here for. And he says, well, I can't tell you everything. I just can't tell you everything. I'm going to tell you what you want to know. So like, what is he expecting at this point? If he's expecting this depiction of himself, then why isn't he just open and honest and letting everything flow? Why is it that from the get-go, he's setting up a wall and saying, nah, we're just going to talk about what I want to talk about? So what this does then is quite well summed up by the flagship's Rich Craich, who said this in one of our haunts. This could easily be called like the real story of Vince McMahon's WWE rather than just the real story of Vince McMahon. It feels more like a WWE DVD or one of those A&E WWE docs, right? Deeply intertwined with the company's history, not necessarily about the man behind it. Vince himself, like I said, likes to keep the lines blurred between Vince McMahon and Mr. McMahon, and that's exactly how the documentary portrays it. There's attempts to try and separate the two, but they're so surface level and there's no depth to it. And we spend more time talking about the successes and productions of WWE and going and digging into the weeds of that we really don't spend any time trying to get to the heart of who Vince is. Maybe this is why Vince was so bothered by it, that the real him never got to shine, I guess. But then again, Vince, like I mentioned, seemed to have established a playing field where I'm just going to tell you what you want to know, and we're not going to go all that deep. Vince has always been in control of his narrative. If nothing more came forth, it's because Vince didn't let it. Towards the end of the doc, you have Bruce Pritchard, right, who returns to shoot some more footage after his original interviews that happened, months previous to that. Because, like we said, a lot of the interviews had happened way before the Janelle Grant stuff had happened. Most of them, actually. So there was there's a lot of people who were there who were interviewed before any of these allegations and reports came forward. But Bruce Pritchard did both. He did post, pre and post Janelle Grant lawsuit, and he came back and he outright said, he was asked. You could hear the interviewer say, "You saw some early cuts of the documentary," and Pritchard goes, "Yes." What did you think of what do you think of what you saw? And Pritchard outright says, "It sucks. I thought it sucked." And he uses the same talking point as Vince does. We don't really get to see. I don't think you portrayed Vince in a fair light. And then he gives the anecdote where Vince helped his wife, Pritchard's wife, with paying for her treatment for cancer a few years ago. He says this exemplifies what Vince McMahon is. It shows the kind of man he is. And that's who Vince McMahon is to me. And I'm like, Bruce, this is, in my head, I'm not actually talking to him, but in my head, I'm like, Bruce, this is fantastic. Good for you. But these personal stories are never really shared or explored. Instead, what the documentary does is focus on the same old topics. The road to WrestleMania 1, the Montreal screw job, 93,000 people in the Pontiac Silverdome, Ted Turner, the steroid trial, the Attitude Era. It's the familiar WWE mythology that was shared. We hear from people like Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff and others recounting stories we've heard 100 times before. These stories that have become legend, that are part of this mythos, right? So when the series does decide, though, to dive into something potentially interesting, like, for instance, the strained relationship between Vince and Shane in episode 5, it barely scratches the surface. Just as you think you're about to learn something new, that we're going to get into the nitty gritty as to why Shane decided to leave WWE in 2009, right? And they mention it a couple of times. Oh, well, their relationship was strained. And, why was it strained? What happened? Give us some events. Let's get into it. Did they fight? Did they argue? It was all very, very surface level, attacking the subject with generalizations. Like, for instance, oh, they were just always at odds. Or what happened to them? Why did they grow apart? Oh, well, Shane wanted Vince to buy UFC. Vince said no, and that was it. It just left us wanting more. The places, the spots where we could have learned more about Vince were just remained very, very high level and uninteresting ultimately. So yeah, on that front, it struggles. It flirts with going deep, but ultimately settles for retelling the myth of Vince McMahon, the genius visionary who built an empire from nothing, a man who survived controversy after controversy, who stood up to the federal government and won. Invincible, undefeatable Vince McMahon, right? In episode 6, the doc concludes with, a bad man gone sentiment, focusing on how WWE is thriving without Vince, a clear attempt to close the chapter on this era while reinforcing the image of the company's resilience and that it is better than ever without the bad man. Probably also, doing good by their partner Netflix, right? With whom they have a huge deal now. They're entrenched into this huge rights deal with Netflix. So that was part of it too, right? To make sure that we're able to snap the past away, toss it behind, and continue moving forward. Just like Vince said a few times in the documentary, I'm not worried about the past. I'm focused on moving forward. But still, despite his complaints, it's worth remembering that Vince always knew what story was going to be told here. He's the master of narrative control. So why he felt the need to issue an official statement on Twitter, on the lead up to the documentary, or to try to buy back the documentary some time ago, I mentioned that earlier, even calling on his pal Ari Emanuel to help, it's a little puzzling. Was it the pressure of the Wall Street Journal investigations catching up to him, or was it just simply the frustration of seeing his legacy framed in a way he couldn't fully dictate? Either way, Vince's actions seem to contradict his own words from the start of the documentary. And we can go over the episodes here. I don't want to go too deep. There are some people who are doing very detailed breakdowns of every episode. This is not what I want to do here. I just want to go over every episode sort of to reinforce these points that I'm making. Like in episode 1, which by the way starts in 2021 is when they started filming. You start to understand that they're going to have all these key figures in Vince's past, all associated with WWE. Vince is reluctant to talk about himself, but he still participates in framing the narrative. And I think the fact that he displays that he's reluctant is part of that narrative. At the same time, we're reminded of the many interviews that were conducted before the Janelle Grant lawsuit and the Wall Street Journal expose. The rest of episode 1 kind of feels like a recap of Vince's early days, growing up poor, meeting his father at 12 years old, while he was living in a trailer park, his rise in the wrestling business. It's all factual, right? It's all things that Vince has told us that we know about, but it doesn't do any deep dives. They touch on the origins of Hulkamania, of course, the Cyndi Lauper's involvement in wrestling, the infamous David Schultz, John Stossel incident, but the documentary doesn't explore these in depth. And I can understand why it doesn't as well, because the focus of this documentary is to paint a picture regarding Vince McMahon and the WWE. So, going down the path of the Stossel incident, right? That's something that warrants its own episode. And there's multiple things in this doc that are attacked from a very surface level, but I can appreciate that in regards to the production constraints, they can't suddenly start diving into, the death of Owen Hart, for instance, or the Jimmy Snuka stuff, or the Ring Boys, because all of these elements could easily be documentaries on their own or be a full-blown episode. Most of them have been covered by the Dark Side of the Ring series, so the levels that are the levels and depth that are involved in these incidents that require a lot of time to break down and really get to the essence of it. So that was episode 1. Episode 2 dives more into the wrestling boom of the 80s and right into the 90s, the grueling schedule that the guys had to endure, and of course the steroid scandals. You had Hulk Hogan's appearance on Arsenio Hall, where he denied steroid use despite Vince advising him to come clean. Which was a key moment, right? It's an era-defining segment, and one that had tremendous repercussions. There's also a brief mention of Hulk Hogan snitching on Jesse Ventura, who was attempting to unionize the wrestlers, which is interesting because it's probably one of the only true new bits of information that came out of the documentary. It had been heavily implied that Hogan was the guy who snitched to Vince. And it was, I even believe Vince said, yeah, it was Hogan who told me in some interview at some point. But Hogan never fessed up to it. And for Hogan to be, yeah, I did it. I did it and I do it again, essentially, is what it boiled down to. That was new. That was some new information. We got that clarification. Not that anyone who knew it was really surprised, but nonetheless, it was interesting for him to actually have a no bullshitting moment, which is rare for Hogan. The documentary touches also, well, this episode I should say, touches on some of the darker corners of that era as well, including the allegations around, like I mentioned, Jimmy Snuka, the Ring Boy scandal, which was a big deal. Bret Hart outright calls Mel Phillips a pedophile in this segment. But again, the doc really doesn't spend a lot of time on these topics. Is there a reluctance to stay on some of these uncomfortable moments, or is it something that just you can only cover so much in a documentary that is spanning decades over a man and his company, his empire, essentially? I kind of lean more towards the latter here, where there's only so much time available to cover these topics. In episode 3, we get into the steroid trial with Hulk Hogan ending up testifying against Vince. It's noted that Hogan was granted immunity but despite the immunity, he ended up protecting Vince with the federal agents just sort of shrugging and looking at each other. What the hell is he doing here? Weren't you supposed to be on our side? From there, we transition into the New Generation era talk, with Bret Hart stepping up as the face of WWE, and leading into the rise of Monday Nitro and WCW, of course, the Monday Night Wars. And if you're like me, you groaned audibly when this started to kick in, because I have seen so many documentaries and stories and videos and retellings and recountings of the friggin' Monday Night Wars. Like, we need to set this into the past. We have to take a bit of Vince's advice here and relegate that to the past so we can start moving forward. I mean, it's, again, nothing you've never heard of if you're a pro wrestling fan. However, if you were a pro wrestling fan and you were sitting down with your partner and they were watching this as someone who is not a pro wrestling fan, well, there's a bunch of really interesting information that came out here to help draw a bigger picture. And ultimately, that's what the audience that this documentary was trying to get. I think it's important to underscore that. The audience that they were trying to attract was much more of a general, dare I say, casual audience than just your typical hardcores. And they succeeded. They succeeded in creating a documentary that spoke to non-fans. I think it's very successful on that point. By episode 4, the narrative then shifts to the Attitude Era, which again had me rolling my eyes so hard I could see my brain, and the birth of the Mr. McMahon character. So it took us 4 episodes to get to the idea that, you know, there is a fictionalized McMahon that exists. It's Mr. McMahon, a personification of Vince's real life business tactics, ultimately, right? But again, this episode, cranked up. We got a personification, but cranked up to 1,000, right? Overblown, over the top. But again, like, this episode feels like a retread of, dozens of Attitude Era docs and podcasts already out there. There's nothing new, and the show kind of glosses over Owen Hart's tragic death as well. Basically saying, basically giving an opportunity here to show, to establish the idea that Vince probably was, that WWE, I should say, was not responsible for Owen's death, when in reality, it's a lot more debatable when you start looking at the police reports from the Kansas City PD. Anyway, again, this is something that, there's already a Dark Side of the Ring episode on. There's so much stuff. So I can understand why they had to do this. And of course, we talk about the Montreal screw job. We also talk about the Wendy Richter screw job. And what I thought was interesting in both of these circumstances is how Vince sort of portrayed both Richter and Brett as prima donnas, right? It's like, hey, you guys you just have a title that belongs to me, and you just have to follow a script and drop the title, right? And he sort of blows them off at, like, them being prima donnas. Oh, they didn't want to do business the right way, essentially. So I had to take the belt off of them because the belt belonged to me. It was the right thing to do for business. Well, I would argue that the right thing to do for business was probably do right by their demands and expectations. One thing that wasn't covered in this documentary when it came to Wendy Richter, is that leading up to her screw job, she had been asking Vince for a raise. She was making less money than the prelim guys on the show, and she, as many people will agree with, was an intrinsic part of WWE going mainstream, the rock and wrestling connection, right? Of course. The first appearance on MTV, she was an integral part of that. The Cyndi Lauper stuff, like, she was a lot of this connective tissue. She was even being featured on the Hulk Hogan Saturday morning cartoon, but she wasn't getting any royalties. She just wanted to make more money, like a respectable amount of money, and Vince was stonewalling her. And instead of, I guess, doing business the right way, as Vince likes to say, well, he screwed her out of the title. What'd she do? She packed up and she left. Like, it was the ultimate show of disrespect. And when it comes to Brett, well, money was at the core of the issue because the 20-year contract that Vince had set up for him, Vince realized, I can't possibly honor this. This is ridiculous. So he basically told Bret, I won't be able to pay you, but why don't you go negotiate with WCW and find, go get yourself the big bag of cash over there that I will not be able to provide for you. So he allowed him to go. Never forget that Vince was the guy who gave him permission to do that. And unlike what Vince said, where it was like, I was afraid that Bret was going to show up on Nitro with the belt and, pull a Medusa essentially in the Lunger Blaze. He was so afraid that Bret was going to do that he had to take the title off of him because Bret was refusing to drop it. When in reality, Bret, who, if my memory serves me right, did have creative control in his contract, basically told Vince, I'm ready to drop this title, but not in Canada. It was framed as though Bret didn't want to drop it to Shawn Michaels because they hated each other. Bret has always maintained, I didn't like Shawn, but I'm a professional and I'm going to do the right thing. He didn't have a problem dropping the belt to Shawn. What he had a problem with was dropping the belt in Canada. And for him, he might as well have just been stripped or whatever. He just did not want to drop the belt there. Well, ended up with the screw job and all of that. But just so that we know, it's not a question of being a prima donna or not, or whatever. There's much more intrinsic stuff underneath that wasn't mentioned. And again, I understand that there's a lot of details that there's a lot of stuff in these screw job moments that require a lot of time to break down if you really want to get into the details. But you could do like what I just did right here. Add just 2 to 3 more minutes just to give a counterpoint to whatever Vince is saying, and you move on, right? I think that would have been possible. But nonetheless, of course we had to go in depth with the Montreal Screwjob. But then again, I also understand that it's connected to the creation of the Mr. McMahon character. In episode 5, we talk about the family dynamic, or at least that's what I thought we were going to talk about, because all four McMahons, I should say. I tried to say kids in it, but all 4 members of the McMahons were all 4 of them were interviewed for the doc, including Linda. So I was like, oh, okay. Maybe we're going to hear a little more about this dynamic, this family dynamic, which of course is unusual, is a little weird, and requires, but where would benefit from getting a little more insight. I think like this is something that is never really spoken about. So it would have been really fun to dive a little deeper. But again, there's nothing really there. We don't even talk about the status of Vince and Linda's relationship in this one, which is, mystery number 1 to most fans. You don't really get a sense of what this family truly is about, We talk about the Trish Stratus, Mr. McMahon angle and the documentary seemingly defending that no one had a problem with it at the time. And there's a heavy emphasis on how unusual the McMahons are, but, that they're unusual, but also, tight. And we use the word love quite a bit. Stephanie says she loves her brother. Vince said, he loved his dad. Shane says he loves his dad, but you never really see it. You never quite understand fully the complexity of these relationships that is always said that they have. I don't know. It's a weird episode, which really brought things down, at least for me. And episode 6 wraps things up with the documentary's thesis overall. Vince McMahon's departure from WWE was inevitable once the the Wall Street Journal allegations started to drop, and the company is now better off without him. They touch on the power vacuum left by Vince's exit, framing the new era of WWE leadership as a fresh start, a company who is thriving in a post-Vince era despite his legendary imprint on its past. Yet, the documentary falls in the same trap of mythologizing Vince's empire building while leaving so much about the man himself left untouched and unsaid. Listen, if you're a die-hard wrestling fan, there's probably not a lot here that you haven't already heard. I've said this a couple of times, but it bears repeating. The storylines, the controversies, even the backstage dynamics of most of what we heard here have been covered in other documentaries, books, interviews, podcasts, newsletters. The information has been out there for a while. If you're a fan of Vince, though, I think the documentary won't change your mind. It paints him as a visionary genius who built an empire against all odds, right? There's nothing here that challenges that image. Despite touching on some of its darker moments, Vince, the man, the myth, will remain untouchable in the minds of his fans and supporters. On the flip side, if you're a Vince hater, there's equally little here to sway your opinion. The doc skirts around some of the most damning details. It's all things that you've heard about and make your blood boil, and you'd love to see Vince get his comeuppance for, but it never seems like we commit to that. The doc just leaves out enough to prevent any deep exploration of the controversies and the man who is behind them. Overall, at the end of the day, it's an exercise in maintaining the same narrative that has defined Vince McMahon for years. Larger-than-life figure whose complexities remain mostly untold. What you walk away with here depends largely on your opinion you walked in with. Those are my thoughts.